Hey, it's Nate here again, and today I'm going to talk about some of my experiences while I was a soldier at Fort Hood, Texas. So during my time in the Army, I was in the Army for 7 years. I was at Fort Rucker, Alabama for flight training. I was at Fort Drum, New York with 10th Cab, Combat Aviation Brigade. I was at Fort Hood, Texas with 4th Cab Combat Aviation Brigade and 21st Cavalry Brigade, and then I was in U.S. Army garrison at Yongsan, Korea, in Seoul, back when it was there, and I also was in Afghanistan and RC West. But specifically Fort Hood, I am not a fan of Fort Hood. It is called the Great Place, which is very ironic. It's one of the largest military installations in the world. Um, it's also sort of in the middle of nowhere, and the infrastructure that exists around it only exists because there's a large population of military there. So everything feels sort of generic. It's not very pretty, and there's just a lot of it's just sort of a weird culture and a sort of a dark vibe there in general. I love Texas though. I lived in a small town called Salado, which was just really beautiful, and then Austin was right down the road, and I just love Austin too. But just a couple stories about Fort Hood. Um, they had a suicide countdown clock that whenever you drove onto the base, it had a digital countdown of the last how many days had elapsed since the last person had committed suicide. And while I understand the intent of that, I don't think it was a. I think it in of itself sort of made you think about suicide in a way that maybe you didn't want to because it just was depressing. And I'm not sure that it really helped. Um, Another thing too is when my unit was preparing to deploy to Afghanistan was also the during the time when that major shot people in the medical clinic. I'm not sure if you remember hearing that story, but my unit was supposed to go through the clinic that day, and we had rescheduled for other pre-deployment needs. But I remember just the stress of trying to get ready for a deployment and all the things we had to prepare for. We heard that gunmen were loose, and we just sort of locked down the hangar we were in and took accountability. But it was this sort of like this. We were in this mode where it was not as shocking as you might think it would be, even though it was. We just sort of were so caught up in all these things we had to do. I don't know. I just take that as a lesson as maybe certain things aren't as important as you think they are in the moment. You should really sort of stop and smell the roses sometimes. But that was a sort of a weird memory from Fort Hood. And then my last little story here is we had a suicide awareness day. And so everyone had to stop and go to these classes on suicide awareness. And when you're trying to get a unit ready to deploy and you have to meet all these mandatory training requirements, and there's like never enough time in the day, the last thing you want to do is completely cut a day out to go and do classes on suicide. Now, I understand the importance of raising awareness, but I think something the Army was getting wrong was that they were missing the point on maybe some of the cultural issues as why people were stressed out and feeling like they just didn't have any time to really work through it themselves. So anyway, we go to this mandatory suicide brief, and then it's time for lunch. But you got to realize they're releasing a lot of soldiers at the same time to go eat lunch. And you have to be back at a certain time to start the brief again. And there was this extreme like pressure to go eat and then come back. And by the way, they prevented people from leaving post because they really wanted us back on time. And what happened was it created a massive traffic jam. People were not getting a chance to eat anything. And then people were scrambling back to get back to this place to be on time for the brief. And it was sort of like this ironic moment where me and some of the other officers were like, this is part of the problem. It's like there's this mandatory I care about you stuff, but then it was followed up with, but we're not going to really look into how we're doing things day by day to how it might affect the stress levels of these people who are already very stressed out and going through a lot in a lot of cases. And then during the brief, there was a senior enlisted soldier talking about how much he cared about us. And then in a split second, he jumped on this one young soldier who was chewing his nails, just habitually chewing his nails. And so this guy's up there telling us how much he loves us. And if you're chewing your nails, you're wrong. And he points out this one young soldier, singles him out, and then everybody's looking at this guy like, what just happened? And all it did was feel like you're constantly on edge, like, what are we going to get in trouble for now? Like, what is going on? And it's like a lot of lip service, but not a lot of really action-oriented doing. And so, like, the general feeling I had of Fort Hood, and not the Army and not the people at all, but like just Fort Hood as a culture during that time was just full of very stressed out, very overworked people who were really didn't have the time and energy to really figure out what the real problems were. And everyone was so caught up in just trying to keep up with this tempo for deployments and getting ready for combat and coming back from war and stuff, that it was just this sort of a silly cycle of toxicity that really didn't help. But I survived Fort Hood, as did most people, and I look back and I have lessons learned from that experience. But definitely some things we can learn on how to make it better. But I'm curious to hear in the comments some of your experiences if you were stationed there or you had stuff like that happen. But those are some of my war stories from Fort Hood, Texas. Thanks for watching.